All right, so we thought we would turn to a discussion of a very often neglected seminar, Seminar 18, on a discourse that might be Semblance. This is right after the infamous Seminar 17 on the other side of psychoanalysis, which is probably one of the most political seminars of Lacan. What drawed me to it originally was actually the concluding chapter of Zizek's Less Than Nothing, where he invokes, because I've been doing a lot of work on Miller and the late Lacan, he invokes, you may remember, a very interesting debate around semblance and its political significance, in fact. And Zizek drew our attention to the way that certain forms of liberal thinking around, let's say, things like identity or justice, or even more broadly speaking, the category of political truths itself, must actually be retained as a kind of nominalist semblance. In other words, there's a kind of necessary cynicism which permeates contemporary culture, and that the status of political truth should not be messed with too much. We should not push or pry into the kind of metaphysical underbelly of the real, of what sustains political truths. To do so would threaten what? Well, this would constitute a threat to the very stability of the social order, right? So you have here a kind of homage to a certain necessary illusion, right, that sustains the way that we orientate ourselves to thinking race, to thinking class, to thinking these kind of categories that organize our conception of political life, right? And for Miller, this is necessary. This is actually one of the reasons why the Clinic of Irony is so significant. And it's also why the very meaning of the non-duped heir, which is a late Lacan maxim, refers to this way that the subject relates to the semblance. Yeah? And that there is a certain way of reading Lacan, therefore, as, let us say, participating in the same liberal pessimism, right? Because as an aside, you know, since the opening of modernity in political thought, there has been a split with the Jacobin orientation within liberal bourgeois thought towards the conception of politics as being grounded or foundationalized in some way. We can debate on the status of foundation precisely, but what is insisted upon is that political truths have a real universal dimension to them, right? And that therefore they cut social orders, they cut bodies, they cut collectives, right? They perform scissions. And this, in some sense, is where you think dialectics as well. Versus a long tradition of liberal thought, for which Mill, de Tocqueville, and many others insist on a nominalist orientation. So this is not a new debate. And I like this way of framing the problem because it aligns with an antagonism which you all know is sympathetic to my own thinking, which is precisely a kind of liberal socialist antagonism, right? Or lack thereof in some cases, right? Because if we accept the Millerian orientation, I think one of the consequences is we're foreclosing the very question of antagonism. With that said, if you reread the last chapter of Less Than Nothing, I personally am not convinced with Zizek's alternative, although he does make one beautiful point, which is that there is a kind of redoubled ideology at play in the liberal nominalist position that is insisting that everything is basically at the level of semblance, insofar as part of what animates that is precisely the idea that what stability, quote unquote, affords is a certain relation of the body to real enjoyment. So if we want to talk about real, we can only really talk about real qua symptom or real qua individual idiosyncratic enjoyment, like to each their own enjoyment would be the maxim, right? And in order to sustain that maxim, according to the liberal pessimist, the field of political truths must remain in a kind of semblance status. Okay, I think Zizek makes a nice point, which is what's missed here is precisely the notion that there are already antagonisms, I don't know, exclusions, inequalities, racial issues, and so on, right? Which prevent this quasi-liberal utopia from itself functioning, right? So like, in a certain sense, the whole notion of the non-duped heir becomes such that the liberal analyst is the one who's duped in their very proposal of the formula itself, you see? So I thought that was a nice point, but he then gets into how even the real, right, as such, like real as impossible, yeah, should also be treated as semblance. And so anyways, I'm going on this kind of diversion just to set up something that I think will be more accessible to us before we get into the text. Apologies.
When you talk about liberal nominalism,
mm-hmm.
do you, the way I understand the word nominalism is that it's just all there is, you know, theory of names. There's names, and all there is these can't be touched. We know that they're not true. We know that there's no real substance behind them, but we can't really impinge upon them. And there's something but beyond those names, there's something universal which stretches beyond all cultures. Is that what you mean, or?
Yeah, that's something that we'll see maybe tonight if we get far enough, because there are Marxist students in the seminar room with Lacan who push him on this question of nominalism, because really stretching back way far in the very introduction of the concept of name of father, we have the kind of one way to read Lacan, which would be that the kind of proper name, and he even says this about Oedipus, is precisely this kind of point for the construction of meaning, right? Insofar as that distinction between metonymy and metaphor, while the name of the father establishes for the subject the possibility of metaphor, like introduces the subject into field of speech, which is not a pure metonymy and so on. It's not a pure difference. So there's something about the name, which is, and he even says something in this seminar, which we'll get to later, that the name should be treated numerically in the same way the Oedipus complex should be treated numerically as the one, right? Whereas, and then he splits that along the lines of sexual difference, and will say that the maternal is basically the kind of access to zero, to infinity, whereas the name kind of instantiates an order. It instantiates a point by which, and that point is established through castration, right?
Okay, that's
so there is a debate. There is a debate, and there is what I wish to suggest, kind of two ways to read Lacan on this issue of nominalism. He's insisting in Seminar 18 that we're looking at that he's not a nominalist. Zizek saying that there's a kind of Malarian liberal nominalism around this status of semblance. So that's what we're talking about. Now, nominalism has a long debate tradition going back to the status of real universals, coming out of a kind of St. Thomas Aquinas, readings of Aristotle. Some argue it predates that, but we don't have the time to basically get into this long genealogy, but it's something that I'm deeply interested in. But what I'm saying is that when it truly becomes of political significance is in the post-French Revolutionary period, right?
May I just cut in with one question? Is it fair to say too, I mean, when we get into nominalism as, I guess, a philosophical category, and also as, or rather, can we also see it as a function or a question of function too? Because doesn't it sort of comes up in a discussion of what is a universal and what is really the nature of the concept. And so we have things like, well, anyway, I think nominalism ends up getting kind of placed in this idea of like, yeah, it can't be instantiated or reduced to anything sort of real, but there is a function it has insofar as it's still operating relationally, and it has effects that way. So is that, I don't know, is that at play at all in this at the level of function?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh,
Okay.
oh, definitely. Yes. I think he wants to suggest that Aristotelian logic, and he'll suggest this in the first, I think the first or the second day of the seminar, introduces the notion of function. And it's from there that we embark upon this whole problematic. But I think we will see, because you see one of the issues here that I think is important when we look at the question of nominalism, is that I think we should frame it internal to the Lacanian field of concepts, right? Insofar as what this seminar is kind of trying to do is begin to think about the consequences of a society no longer structured around name of the father, like a post-Oedipal social arrangement. And in that milieu, you can retain the kind of procedure of name of the father on condition that it is taken by the subject as a semblance, right? So I'm only introducing these things just to provoke you, because I think some folks have reached out to me and said, why do you want to study this seminar? And I'm just trying to say straight out, this is why I want to study it. And I think others have their own reasons for studying this seminar, and I'd love to hear thoughts on that. I know like Duane and I think Aaron were talking about how it's a really pivotal kind of in-between seminar, right? Before Encore, after the other side of psychoanalysis. So I think there's a sense in which the concept of semblance kind of disappears or dissipates, but yet still animates something very significant in the trajectory of Lacan. So there's also this kind of, let's call it, intra-conceptual field work that draws me to this as well. And I think others share that as well. Let me also say that Russell Grigg has written a nice, very short, very accessible kind of introduction to the concept of semblance in Lacan. I highly recommend it. It's on lacan.org. I'll link to it in the chat. I think a couple of things should be mentioned about what he says before we actually begin, just very quickly. The first is that one way to think about the concept is to understand it as the flip side of the Freudian notion of the uncanny, but as aligned more with the logic of the fetish, okay? That is, that semblance is operating at a level of knowledge, right? It's operating at a level of knowledge, and it is operating on a logic of Verdegung, like, sorry, my German pronunciation is terrible, but the basic idea here is denial or avoidance, this kind of status or of behaving as if, right? Behaving as if, even though I know. This is the status of semblance, which is that there is something within knowledge, which if I let it go, I'm overwhelmed with an anxiety such that, just like the logic of fetish, another object will have to replace it, right? In order to sustain or to fend off anxiety in some sense. And so that means that it is satisfying, even though it is recognized by the subject in knowledge as a substitute object. So it is satisfying, even though the subject recognizes it as a substitute, right? So I think here we're introduced to almost kind of like a very straightforward definition of ideology, even like, say, Žižekian ideology as well. So I think that's a super significant point. I think the other point that's really useful here is that Grigg says very clearly, before we get in, I'm just trying to do this kind of groundwork. I hope this is helpful. How do you understand the difference between semblance and the objet A? Well, he says very nicely that we can think of this difference when the subject is faced with the collapse of a semblance. So when a hole emerges or an inconsistency point emerges within the, I don't know, wider constellation of, say, my orientation to a particular ideology, it's at that point that objet A emerges, right? So objet A is, in some sense, is this kind of crossover point, which keeps the semblance consistent, right? Which fends off the real in a certain way. I thought that was very helpful as well. And then he says that the Molaire orientation provides a completely different theory of semblance, which Lacan will talk about in this seminar, which is around basically signification, as a logic of signification, as a logic of how it becomes actually very close, almost indistinguishable in some sense, from the way in which the signification of the nonsense point, of the concentration of a point, of the phallus, produces something. Like it produces something precisely from this point of nonsense, kind of like a hook that hangs within a symbolic coordinate. That's a phallic logic. On the other hand, he says a semblant logic is different than that because the subject is engaged with it through a kind of, I guess you could say, through a kind of positing of it in some way. So anyway, so just check out that Grigg piece, because again, really good to get our bearings. I don't know about you all, but I kind of like to get my bearings on things before I jump in. So yeah, any comments before we, so yeah, so let's talk actually about the cartel itself. So I've done a few cartels. I think some of you all have as well. Here's what I understand them to be. Actually, Dwayne, I don't know if he's with us, it's posted something really nice recently, where he said, hi Dwayne. It was an article where he said basically that there's a certain trauma of reading Freud and Lacan in isolation, and that part of the kind of elementary function of the cartel is to alleviate that, right? I think the other purpose is to structure the cartel ideally around a kind of multiplicity of people that read passages. So we read line by line. I might ask people to read, just, you know, and then we gain a certain flow. Now, there is this thing called the +1, and the +1, as I understand it, and I think I'd love to invite others to jump in on this, sort of functions to pry and to push the envelope of where we're headed. I'm not sure that the +1 is actually identified per se. This figure kind of emerges from the interaction of the cartel. We have right now 19 people on board, so this is, I don't know if others would say this is taboo in terms of, or too large. It may be. You know, I don't know what others think. Usually what you have 6 at the most. I think all of that's fine. But that's basically my plan, is to read the text. I'll share it on my screen. And I've obviously highlighted things I think are significant. And we can just kind of flow through it. Let me also say one thing. Today, so I read the text a couple days ago, but then today I was listening to an English just audio, which was so good. And Kayam shared it with me. I'll share it in the chat, or maybe Kayam could share it in the chat. But, you know, like I was just driving to pick up my kids at school. And, you know, like I was following it, which is kind of saying something for a Lacan seminar. So I kind of like the idea of reading the seminar carefully and then following it up with kind of listening to it as well. Anyways, I'm going to stop there and ask if anybody would like to say something before we begin. Okay. Alrighty. Can everybody see that okay? Good. Okay, so the the Gallagher translation actually starts with the very last day. Dominic Hones, I don't know if anyone knows Dominic. I spoke with him this morning. He's not able to make it because it's a little bit late. He's in Belgium. I think he's in Belgium. But he pointed this out to me, which is that this first one here is misdated. This content, okay, is actually the very last seminar of Seminar 18. So it starts off with the very last one, which may be intentional. I don't know if that's something that Gallagher was messing with us or if he had some reason to do that. So I read the first one, which is really the last one, okay? And it's very good. It's basically proposing a new theory of monotheism in relation to the discourse of the hysteric. Is super, super good. Anyways, so let's begin. So on a discourse that might not be a semblance, a discourse, it is not mine that is at stake. I think I made you sense well enough last year what should be understood by this term, discourse. I remind you of the discourse of the master and what we could call its four positions, the displacements of its terms with respect to a structure, reduced to being tetrahedral. I left whoever wanted to work on it to specify what motivates these slidings, glicements, which could have been more diversified. I reduced them to four. If no one has worked on it, I will perhaps this year give an indication in passing about the privilege status of these four. I only took up these references with respect to what was my end, stated under the title, The Reverse Side of Psychoanalysis. The discourse of the master is not the reverse side of psychoanalysis. It is where there is demonstrated the torsion that is proper, I would say, to the discourse of psychoanalysis. What ensures that this discourse poses the question of a front and a back, because you know the importance, the emphasis that is put in the theory ever since Freud stated it, the importance and the stress that is put on the notion of a double inscription. Now, what I wanted you to put your finger on is the possibility of a double inscription on the front, on the back, without an edge being crossed. It is this structure, well known for a long time, that I only had to use, which is called the Mobius strip. These places and these elements are where there is outlined what is, properly speaking, discourse, and can in no way be referred from a subject, even though it determines him. This, no doubt, is the ambiguity of that through which I introduced what I thought I should make understood with psychoanalytic discourse. Okay, so what he's doing here is he's saying that there is a kind of double inscription, which, as I read it, is referring to the core thesis of the way that the subject emerges upon the kind of interaction between two signifiers, right? Or rather, it's kind of the excess or the product of that interaction, right? On the one hand, I think on the other hand, he's talking about the way that the movement of the discourses, right? And we know that the movement goes from masters to hysteric, to university, to and the discourse of the analyst. And we know that those are historically periodized, right? Such that their movements turn on a kind of a quarter, right? So they're, and I can pull up if it's helpful, I can share the math themes with you all in a moment. I think you're familiar with them, but I can share them. But this is, I think, is what he's trying to basically elaborate to start things off. He's now going to move to this question of intersubjectivity, in part because he's wanting to address the following kind of pop items: intersubjectivity, how his thesis or his teaching relates to it, logical positivism, structuralism, and linguistics, right? So you'll see that in the first 4 days of the seminar, he's spending some time kind of responding to the cliches that have already been developed in the culture about the Lacanian school itself, right? And so he kind of starts off here with this. To clarify precisely what his theory of the subject is, right? So a discourse can in no way be referred from a subject, even though it determines him, right? This is elusive, and this is going to be elaborated. This, no doubt, is the ambiguity of that through which I introduced what I thought I should make understood with psychoanalytic discourse. Remember my terms at the period that I entitled a certain report as the function of field of speech and language in psychoanalysis. At that time, I wrote intersubjectivity, and God knows the number of false tracks that the statement of terms like that can give rise to. I hope I will be excused for having been the first to make these tracks. I was not able to go ahead except through a misunderstanding. Inter, certainly in effect, is the only thing that subsequently allowed me to talk about an intersignificance, intersignificance, or intersignifiance, subjectivity from its consequences, the signifier being what represents a subject for another signifier where the subject is not. This indeed is how it is because of the fact that where he is represented, he is absent, that nevertheless being represented, he thus finds himself divided. As for discourse, it is not simply that it can henceforth only be judged in the light of its unconscious sources. It is also the fact that it can no longer be stated as anything else than what is articulated from a structure where somewhere he finds himself alienated in an irreducible fashion. Okay, questions or comments on this thus far? If we proceed without any frustrating questions of I don't understand, then we must assume that everyone understands, and we know that understanding is impossible, at least fully. But so far so good, or what do you think?
I had a quick question. Just in terms of what you said, is the subject emerging from the were you framing it as like a confrontation? Not, I shouldn't say it, but is it the metanomic slide between two signifiers, or is it? I guess I was wondering where the subject emerges between the two signifiers. Yeah, and where he says where the subject is not a little bit further up in this page, I was confused as to where the location is. Because I know the aphorism, of course, the signifier being what represents the subject for another signifier.
Right.
But I was confused by where the subject is not. Your reading of that, or not reading of it, but the imbrication of two signifiers, where the subject emerges.
Yeah, I mean, this is the core wager of the fact of speech itself, right? That there's a kind of decentrament which is brought about through the proposal of the unconscious in a general sense, but I think more specifically, it's an operation that's intrinsic to the function of meaning making itself, right? Such that, yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in to elaborate on their thinking around this notion of the absence of the subject, right? Or how the subject becomes barred. That's an important question. I want to invite others to jump in on this.
Zizek's always fond of citing this initiative from his time studying with Miller, who in fact draws the example, I think, from Gilbert thought experiment of Gilbert Ryle's. You know, you fold over, you cut a piece of paper or something oh so many times. At a certain point, you don't arrive at another composite, as it were. You know, one piece of paper or another, but rather something and, well, nothing. I think that, I mean, I sense that the source of John's confusion here might arise from the fact it's just the stating that the subject is not. Well, subject is not qua signifier.
Right.
Wrong. A signifier is what has to represent a subject for another signifier. So,
Yeah.
Is it fair to say it might be too simple, but that the subject just is not where the signifier represents the subject? So the subject is always either in excess or even in deficiency of the representation the signifier is providing for the subject. So that would be the location of where the subject isn't, is that side of representation.
Yeah. I like that.
I don't know.
I think that holds, because I think what you're both drawing out is the question of, we can't answer this question until we've done the prior work of defining the status of what the hell a signifier is. And in a moment, he's going to show two things. What's the difference between a signifier and a semblant? And what is the status of signifiers, like what he calls a treasure trove of signifiers within nature, right? Not even within human speech, but he's actually making a claim that signifiers animate nature, right? And he gives a certain logic by which we can understand their presence within a field of meaning, right? So, yeah, I mean, one question would be, can you have a field of meaning that is devoid of signifiers, right? What is the imposition of a signifier within a field of meaning, within a field of speech? What does that disrupt? What is disruptive about a signifier, right? I think those are really important background kind of ways to frame this question as well.
Isn't what's disruptive about a signifier that it produces a subject?
How is that disruptive, though? What is that disruptive to?
Well, doesn't the existence of the subject introduce a disturbance in that placid objective frame? And so, right, I mean, the subject, it's this point of tension that it's either in excess of or in deficiency of whatever's out there setting up representational fields, if it's the signifier or the chain of signifiers.
I
don't.
Maybe. Yeah, I think that could hold.
As regards the kind of idea that the signifier disturbs something in nature, there's a curious vacillation throughout this period of Lacan's work. Lauren, I might be referencing Chiesa's The Not To, a copious amount that's been on my mind a lot in my kind of guide through these seminars, but he makes a lot out of a notion he calls in-dash difference. And essentially, what he's getting at is this curious vacillation during this period of Lacan's work between a statement that, the signifier on the one hand has these profoundly generative effects. It is an instance of creation ex nihilo, and it does create a disturbance of a kind insofar as it is generative of a whole autonomous system of differences, yes? And yet at the same time, Lacan will also say at moments that it changes nothing in nature, that it only changes something in discursive nature, which it inaugurates. And yes, it's a very complicated, dialectic here that, at least in Chiesa's case, he thinks that it requires us kind of thinking conjointly the real that we can affect alongside the real that discourse cannot, in fact, affect.
Wait, say the last part again. The very last thing you said?
Yes, for Chiesa, in-dash difference requires us thinking conjointly the real we can affect with discourse and the real that we cannot affect with discourse.
Interesting. Yeah, this is the two levels of the real that he develops around the real as, would it be fair to say, real as impossible, and then as one pole, and then how would you characterize the other pole of the real?
I suppose you could say it's rather maybe real as structure versus real as impossible.
Yeah. Very nice.
I think that what's, just reading, going up and reading it through, what I felt when he's talking about is that he's talking about discourse, but he doesn't want to associate that with language per se. He wants to break away from prosaic understandings of language. He keeps going back to this notion of the structure. And its structure, and when this structure is present, we're not. And in that sense, there's always an understanding of the unconscious in that as well. So I think, you know, I suppose whenever there's, you know, these sort of prosaic terms that come up, like discourse, language, like Lacan's trying to say, well, look, when we're going to be talking about it, we're going to be talking in a very specific way. And you can see, you know, what the terms coming up in the text here now. It's on my screen. You know, he's trying to associate the term itself with structure. And when we're talking about structure, structure is always related to it in this externate way. Yes, it's there, but at the same time, we're not there.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that's what I felt when I was reading it. I could be completely wrong. You know,
No, I think that's really nice, because the 4 discourses are unique modes of alienation, right? They're unique modes of not being there. They're unique ways. They're unique ways the subject is not present in some sense, or unique ways in which discourse is operating on the subject, right? And we can bring them up and visualize them in a moment.
all right. Well, at least I know.
But yeah. But I think John's provocation was very useful to kind of tease this out, and as we go, we'll learn more. Okay, on a discourse, I stop. It is not mine. It is from this statement, a discourse not being able as such to be a discourse of any particular person, but being founded from a structure and from the emphasis that is given by the division, the sliding of its terms. It is from this that I am starting this year for what is entitled On a Discourse That Will Not Be a Semblance. So now he's moving, by the way, to a discussion about the distinction between like words as written and like letters in versus like discourse as such. So this is just a kind of preface. For those who were not able last year to follow these statements which were made previously, I indicated that the appearance, which dates already for more than a month, of Silicet 2.3 will give them the written reference Silicet 2.3 because it is a writing, it is an event, if not an advent of discourse. First of all, by the fact that it is the one that I find myself to be the instrument of, without avoiding the fact that it requires the pressure of your numbers. In other words, that you should be there, and very precisely under this aspect, a singular aspect of which creates this pressure. Undoubtedly with, let us say, the incidences of our history, which is something that can be touched, which renews the question of what is involved in discourse insofar as it is the discourse of the master. This is something that can only be made of something that one questions oneself about in naming it. Do not go on too quickly to make use of the word revolution, but it is clear that it is necessary to discern what it is, in short, that allows me to pursue my statements with this formula on a discourse which will not be a semblance. 2 features are to be noted here in this number of Silicet. I put to the test, after all, more or less something which is moreover my discourse of last year, in a setting which precisely is characterized by the absence of what I called this pressure of your presence. And to give it its full emphasis, I will say it in these terms. What this presence signifies, I would pinpoint as a pressurized surplus enjoying, a pli de joie pressée. This is, by the way, this is a really nice concept, insofar as what he's talking about is the way that the concentration of the numerical number of people in his seminar constitutes a certain obstacle, right? And it's that kind of congealed point of that presence, which itself is introducing a kind of logic within his own teaching, which I think he's saying is also preventing him from having the same foothold as he would if he's in analysis, right? So he's making basically a claim that this is not an exchange conditioned on free association, I would say. Because it is precisely from this figure that there can be judged if it goes beyond a discomfort, as they say, as regards too much semblance in the discourse, in which you are inscribed, the university discourse, the one that is easy to denounce for neutrality, for example, that this discourse cannot claim to be sustained by a competitive selection when all that is at stake are signs that are addressed to those who are in the know, in terms of a formation of the subject. when it is something quite different that is at stake. So I don't know if anyone has a question on that, but I think the very basic logic of the discourse of the university is that it is a discourse which trades. It's an economy of proper names, of signs that kind of are exchanged in such a way that prevent. Well, what precisely does it prevent? Is the interesting question there. That there's something that the discourse of the analyst is able to show subjects alienated within the discourse of the university that they couldn't see, I think. Nothing allows us to go beyond this kind of discomfort of semblances so that something can be hoped for which allows us to get out of it. Then to posit that a certain style that is required in the advancement of a discourse does not split in a dominant position in this discourse. What is involved in this triage, these globules of surplus and join, in the name of which you find yourselves caught up in the university discourse, it is precisely that someone, starting from the analytic discourse, places himself with respect to you in the position of an analysand. This is not new, I already said it, but no one paid any attention. This is what constitutes the originality of this teaching. This is what justifies what you contribute to it by your pressure. And that is why, in speaking on the radio, I put to the test this subtraction precisely of this presence. So you see the point, which is that these globules of surplus enjoyment that animates subject positions within the university discourse can't overcome this. It's like a stickiness or something like that is how I read this. It's a very interesting point. But somehow Lacan wants to claim that he's able to pry it open, maybe. I put to the test this subtraction precisely of this presence, of the space into which you press yourselves, canceled and replaced by the pure it exists of this intersignificance that I spoke about earlier, in order that the subject can vacillate in it. It is simply a switching of points towards something whose possible import we will learn in the future. So here, John, he's talking about this notion of the, within the university discourse, it's better to say the it exists. So there's a kind of form of alienation that is canceling out some kind of singularity of the subject, is what I'm seeing here.
When he's talking about the someone who, from, like he said, the position of the analyst, or from the analytic discourse, puts themselves in the position of the analysand towards you, he's speaking of himself, right? Like, I think this might even be common sense from some literature, that like these are almost like Lacan's. He's in the position of the analysand with this when he's giving his discourses in the seminars. And I was taking when he's talking about the it exists in the address on the radio, I think he even makes a mention on television as well, when he talks about how like it's to the same audience as his university lectures anyway, but in like that pure sort of abstracted form instead of like the actual individual maybe globules there. But like, and even in his writings, when he talks about like he's hoping that like, I think you analyze his writings and trying to understand them. Like, I don't know, that's just something I thought for a while, and I think I've heard other people talk about, but I think he's referring to himself, right? That he's now in the position of the analysand, and kind of even with some structure, somewhat free associating, I think, right? The kind of how the seminars are set up.
I don't, yeah, I think he's talking about himself. I don't think he's putting himself in the position of the analysand, although maybe that could track. I don't know what others think. I mean, the point is that he's submitting to a certain alienation that he's not in the master's discourse. That much is clear, right? So he's confessing that in some sense, right? This is not a transmission per se of the master's discourse. This is the other side of the master's discourse, which is the discourse of the analyst. But I think whether he's seeing himself, how he sees himself there, is maybe an open question.
and I could be totally wrong here, and I'll just say this very briefly. This is just a guess right now after reading that. But the import in the future, I was even tangentially reading right now as like what it exists of almost that when a lecturer is not speaking in the university discourse, but addressing the audience almost in the way of the analysand, but is familiar with the analytic discourse, what the import of then the audience is. I'm almost thinking of Badiou's line of like the Mao of psychoanalysis, or like the audience potentially plays the analyst, but that's just a speculation on my end. I'll hold there.
Cool. No, I like that. I like that. Well, that kind of related to this notion of, are you all familiar with this publication called Silicet? Does this ring a bell to you? They had this methodology of, I don't know, let's say there's a dozen people that contribute to an issue of the journal, but the proper names are not assigned to a particular text. They're all placed at the end. And so you see immediately the question of how, if Lacan is right that the university discourse is one which seeks a kind of unsatisfactory circulation of names, right? Everything is about making a name for yourself in publishing and so on. You see the subversive gesture of disidentifying that move, right? So in some ways, Silicet is like that. Okay. It means that each of these names that are put in a column on the last page of these three issues that constitute 1 year can be permuted with each of the others, affirming in this way that no discourse can be that of an author. This is a wager. Here it speaks. In the other case, it is here the future will tell if it is the formula that, let us say, in 5 or 6 years, all the other journals will adopt. It's a gamble, we shall see. That's kind of funny because we were talking with Tupanamba about how concepts are embodied so radically personalized today. And what that shows is that there's a kind of huge kind of hegemony of the university discourse, in my view, at our present moment, that's kind of unhinged, I would say. I mean, maybe that's too strong, but you know, this kind of notion of anonymous authorship or even collective authorship is pretty rare in my view. I don't know if others agree, but I'm not trying in what I'm saying to escape from what is experienced, sensed in my statements as accentuating as sticking to the artifact of discourse. This is an important point. This means, of course, it is the least that can be said that doing this rules out my claiming to cover all of it. It cannot be a system, and in this regard, it is not a philosophy. It is clear that for whoever takes from the angle that analysis allows us to renew what is involved in discourse, this implies that one moves around, I would say, in a d'essai univers, which is not the same as a divers or diverse universe. It's, I would not even reject this diverse, and not simply because of what it implies in terms of diversity, but what it also implies in terms of diversion. It is very clear also that I am not talking about everything. It is even in what I state, it resists anyone saying everything about it. Yeah, okay. You can put your finger on that every day, even on the fact that I state that I am not saying everything, that is something different. As I already said, that comes from the fact that the truth is only a half saying, media half saying, which is a familiar point by now. This discourse then, which limits itself to acting only in the artifact, is in short only the prolongation of the position of the analyst, insofar as it is defined by putting the weight of its surplus in join at a certain place. So we think again about the surplus in join globulo that we looked at before, and the importance of placement there. It is nevertheless the position that here I cannot sustain very precisely by not being able, by not being in this position of the analyst. As I said earlier, except for the fact that you lack knowledge about it, it is rather you who will be in it by the pressure of your numbers. So there you are, Cade. I guess you are vindicated then, my friend. This having been said, what can be the import of what in this reference I am stating? So let's take a step back. Okay, we have pressurized surplus jouissance, which puts the subjects listening to the seminar in the position of the analyst. We know that the math theme, I'll pull it up real quick, maybe that would be helpful, is starting from the A, starting from this, right, for the discourse of the analyst. So that itself kind of makes sense to me, but is this clear to everyone? Insofar as discourse of the analyst, the beginning point is this. So yes, I guess that does hold. That's a very interesting point. But what does that make of Lacan as the transmitter of this discourse? It doesn't make sense that he would be analyst Sand, does it?
I'm going to double down on this hand because I'm wondering now if this is even like potentially the other side of psychoanalysis, like outside of the analytic session, maybe even something of what he wanted to go for with his school, where you have, I guess this would be something in addition or adjacent to the past, or maybe you could transmit the learnings from an analysis in a kind of lecture style like this, where then so I'm even thinking with Tupanamba's book, like as opposed where the analyst and the analysand are counted as one in the institutional setting, this would be another way almost where the analyst and analysand are counted as one in like a singular sort of split entity of someone from the analytic position, then transmitting it, maybe not through formal math themes, but through more of a literally discursive approach.
Yeah. No, I like this possibility. It's very interesting to me. Yeah, because like, you know, it has a lot of let's say pedagogical consequences. Okay, so that's very interesting. Okay, on a discourse which might not be a semblance that can be stated from my place and in function of what I previously stated, it is a fact in any case that I am stating it. Note that it is a fact also because I state it. It is a fact in any case that I am stating it, that it is a fact also because I state it. You may be completely hoodwinked by it, namely, think that there is nothing more than the fact that I am stating it. Only if I spoke in connection with discourse about the artifact, it is because for discourse, there is no fact, as I might say, already there. There is only a fact from the fact of saying it. The stated fact is entirely a fact of discourse. This is what I am designating by the term artifact. Okay. This kind of goes back to John's point about the very wager of the fact that discourse is only made possible through utterance, through enunciation. Without that, there's no like meta discourse, right? There's no other discourse. There's only a discourse that is the effect of speech. Point one. Point two, that artifact is the first effect of that or something, like, I don't know, like, okay, let's keep on going.
I wonder if the artifact is, I'm thinking of Radiophonie when he talks about faire semblant, and he's talking about the semblant or the semblant, not semblance. And I just wonder if artifact is the semblant, like when he talks about like making something up, but also to point to something not there.
That's nice. Well, let's keep on going because he talks in a moment, it gets more developed, and I think here we're bringing in nature and all of this interesting stuff. Okay. If I speak about artifact, it is not to give rise in it to the idea of something that might be different, a nature that you would be wrong to get engaged with, engaged in with a view to tackling its obstacles, because you would never get out of it. The question is not set up in the terms, is it or is it not discourse, but in the following: it is said or it is not said. I start from what is said. in a discourse whose artifact is supposed to be sufficient for you to be there. A cut here, because I am not adding, that you should be here in the state of pressurized surplus enjoying. I said a cut because it is questionable whether it is already a pressurized surplus enjoying that my discourse gathers you together. It is not decided, whatever one or other may think, that it is this discourse, the one made up of the series of statements that I present you, that places you where? In this position from which it can be questioned by the not talking of the discourse which might not be a semblance. Are we good? Should I keep on going? The un semblant. What does that mean in this statement? A semblance of discourse, for example. You know that this is the position described as logical positivism. The fact is that if starting from a signifier to be put to the test of something that decides by yes or no, what cannot present itself for this test, this is what is defined as meaning nothing. And with that, people think they have finished with a certain number of questions described as metaphysical. This is certainly not what I maintain. I want to point out to you that the position of logical positivism is untenable in any case starting from analytic experience in particular. If analytic experience finds itself implicated by taking its claims to nobility from the Oedipal myth, it is indeed because it preserves the cutting edge of the oracle's enunciation. And I would say more, that in it, interpretation always remains at the same level. It is only true by its consequences, like every oracle. Interpretation is not put to the test of a truth that can be settled by a yes or a no. It unleashes truth as such. It is true only insofar as it is truly followed. We will see later that the schemas of implication, I mean of logical implication, in the most classical form, these schemas themselves require the foundation of this truthfulness insofar as it belongs to the word, even if it is, properly speaking, senseless. Okay. So logical positivism has nothing to say about senselessness within discourse, number one. Number two, its definition of a semblant is, so I guess my question to you all would be, what would a logical positivist say about discourse? Like, what is their theory of discourse? Could somebody maybe elaborate that as they understand it? Because I think that will help us understand the distinction here.
So basically, I think I'd say that, I don't know, the chief hinge here of Lacan's contest with logical positivism, despite the fact that he will commend some of, its foundations, namely, he'll borrow, say, from Frege's own logical writing. The problem is that logical positivism assumes that there is a truth anterior to falsity, an absolute truth, and that is the antipode to falsity. And in this way, it does take the position of a meta-language.
Right.
Psychoanalysis and as such, discourse could be put to the test of either a true or a false. Yes, psychoanalysis, in contrast, as Lacan said earlier, a fact is a fact only by stating it. He'll later refer also again to the liar's paradox. There's, right, there's the very facticity of anything being said. That's a basic point for Lacan. But moreover, there's the points he wants to convey that psychoanalysis is oriented around a dialectic between truth and semblance, whereby truth becomes truth of fact precisely through discourse's repression of it.
Yes, yes. So yes, therefore, senselessness is completely irrelevant in this way, I suppose.
I mean, in a sense, but also I think senselessness brings us to the issue of writing, which is a big theme here. Writing versus saying. Saying always kind of projects a meta-language. It always, there's these questions. I don't know, it brings to bear a certain weighted question about the enunciating instance. Meanwhile, writing really reinforces the very facticity of itself. It brings to bear this literal component.
Yes. Would anyone like to read where I just stopped and kind of pick up on it? I can, if the screen hopefully is readable for you, I would love for somebody to sort of jump in and
I can.
Go for it, please. I don't know where I ended exactly. I think
I think it's at the end of, yes, the highlight.
Okay, yeah, okay, go ahead.
So, the passage from the moment where the truth is settled by its simple unleashing to that of a logic that is going to try to embody this truth is precisely the moment when discourse, qua representative of representation, is dismissed, disqualified. But if it can be so, it is because some part of it is always there, and this is what is called repression. It is no longer a representation that represents, it is this continuation of discourse that is characterized as effect of truth. The effect of truth is not a semblance. The Oedipus complex is there to teach us, if you will allow me, to teach us that is in red blood. Only there you are. Red blood does not reject the semblance. It colors it. It makes it resemble, ressemblant. It propagates it. A little bit of sawdust and the circus starts up again.
Can you hold there. What is that a reference to? A little bit of sawdust in a circus. Does anybody know? What does that mean?
Well, yeah, they use sawdust to cut on the floor of the circus.
Yeah.
For the refuse of the animals.
Okay, I thought it was a kind of obscure reference to something that. Okay, sorry.
One of the, it's like just out of thing, but sawdust in old working class pubs, they used to put them on the sawdust on the floor, literally to soak up blood and fight things like that. So
okay, there you go. There you go. I think that's what it refers to. I love it. It's so vivid. Keep on going. Sorry.
This is indeed why it is at the level of artifact, of the structure of discourse, that the question can be raised about a discourse that might not be of a semblance. In the meantime, there is no semblance of discourse. There is no meta-language to judge it. There is no other of the other. There is no true of the true. I amused myself one day by making the truth speak. I asked, where is the paradox? What could be more true than saying, I'm lying? The classical quibbling that is stated under the term paradox is only embodied if you put this, I am lying on paper, as something written. Everyone knows that there is nothing truer than that one can say on some occasions than to say, I am lying. It is even very certainly the only truth that is, in this case, not broken. Everyone knows that in saying, I am not lying, one is absolutely not protected from saying something false. What does that mean? The truth that is at stake when it speaks, the one I said, speaks I, which states itself as an oracle. Who speaks?
So then it's fair to say in writing, the artifact is not put into the economy of writing. Writing does not have artifacts. Is that right? Writing does not produce an artifact in this way. Is that right? I think that's. Okay. Sorry, go on.
Okay, yes, answer that. I think I'd have to reread the passages. This semblance is the signifier in itself. Who can fail to see that what characterizes this signifier, that as far as linguistics are concerned, I use in a way that embarrasses them. There were some who wrote these lines designed to clearly warn that undoubtedly Ferdinand de Saussure did not have the slightest idea about it. What do we know about it? Ferdinand de Saussure was like me. He did not say everything. The proof is that people found his papers, things that were never said in his classes. People think that the signifier is a nice little thing that's been tamed by structuralism. People think that it is the other, quite other, and the battery of signifiers, and everything that I explain, of course. Naturally, it comes down from heaven, because from time to time, I am an idealist.
Oh, sorry, hold on. Sorry, hold on. You see this? The semblance is the signifier in itself. I think that's a really telling line in the sense that the semblance is, in a certain way, how the signifier is represented in a way, which is sort of odd to think, which is that it cannot be fully, like there's no total representation possible. There's only a representation qua semblance possible, is one way I would think that through.
I think it was the etymology of the word semblance, or semblance means sort of obsolete, pomp, pretense. So yeah, I mean, like the signifier, it only operates through an operation of pretense.
Yeah. Okay. That holds.
Yeah, it's actually roughly along Marx's lines of pretense that I read the signifier semblance, because it essentially, the signifier always bears with it the semblance of one. It always projects incorrigibly the big O other as existent.
This makes me think of when Badiou talks about nothing is the actual operation of account, where we have unrepresentation structured in part of the structure of representation itself. So we have nothing is the operation of the count, which is the source of the one for Badiou. I just wonder if there's any homology to that. And I'm thinking of the signifier and the signifier, or rather semblance and the signifier relation in that sort of way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very good.
And then it also makes me think too of what McGowan has to say, I think, in Psychoanalysis as a Political Project, about the binary signifier, the missing signifier. And I think he puts it as university discourse ends up actually, like, they're the same. It takes the place of the missing signifier and becomes the binary signifier, apropos the master signifier, but still that way in which, what is it covering over? Nothing, but that nothing is also the source of the signifier.
That sounds like exactly what he's calling semblance, though.
Yeah.
So, I mean, interesting. But yeah, binary signifier is signifier, of loss, of a kind of, but it's a different logical operation than semblance, because again, semblance is more on the side of like knowledge. It's more on the side of the subject in some way. It's more, has like a different logic of mediation, I feel.
Yeah.
Anyways, okay, sorry, Aaron, go on.
Artifact. I said initially, naturally, the artifact. It is absolutely certain that it is our everyday fate that we find it at every street corner, within reach of the slightest gestures of our hands. If there is something that is sustainable, or at least sustained discourse, not specifically that of science, it is perhaps no harm to remember that it started very specifically from the consideration of semblances, the start of scientific thinking. I'm talking about history. What is it? The observation of the stars. What is it if not the constellation, namely the very type of semblance? What do the first steps of modern physics turn around at the start? Not as is believed elements, because the elements, the four, and even if you wish to add a fifth essence, are already discourse, philosophical discourse, and how? They are atmospheric phenomena. Descartes wrote a treatise on meteors. I'm going to botch the French. The decisive step. One of the decisive steps turned around to the theory of the rainbow. And when I talked about a meteor, it is something that is defined by being qualified as such as a semblance. No one has ever believed that the rainbow, even among the primitive people, that the rainbow was something there, set up in a curve. It is questioned as an atmospheric phenomenon. The most characteristic atmospheric phenomenon, the most original one, the one without any doubt is linked to, has the very structure of discourse, is thunder. If I ended my Rome discourse on the evocation of thunder, it is absolutely not like that. By fantasy, no father of the name of the Father is tenable without thunder. And everyone knows very well that we do not even know what thunder is the sign of. It is the very figure of semblance.
Okay, so hold on. So this is very significant because he's making a pivot here, which is the name of the Father is the very figure of semblance, but it's a different kind of semblance than kind of what I was talking about earlier. It's like it's something almost which seems to start discourse precisely because he says like thunder strikes, but its origin point is an unknown. So it starts a kind of process or something like that. But it itself is not the semblance. Is it fair to say then that the effect of the thunder produces a semblance?
I was just thinking precisely what you were thinking there. That what thunder is, when the lightning comes down, it's the air rushing into a gap. So it's this noise that's left after an event, trace, an artifact. Literally, it's something that happens after the fact. When he was talking before about looking at stars are things that aren't there. They're things that have burnt out thousands, millions of years ago, whatever. So is this going back constantly to what is the artifact, or this thing of things being created by a trace, or things that have been created from what you were saying before, ex nihilo, nothing. This emptiness. But it's when he says that the Father, from a pomp, a pretense, and this idea of artifact itself. The word artifact comes from the word to make. Also the etymology of it. So is this idea of how there's a lot of stuff going on here, where the name of the Father is tenable without thunder. Everyone knows well what everyone knows. We do not even know what the thunder is the sign of.
Yeah, I think that's
the very figure of semblance. This notion of it's in the pretense, it's in the pomp, it's in.
Wait until you see the way this paragraph ends. Aaron, if you could read the rest. This is
sorry if
a very frustrating thing. Let's go on.
Sorry, Daniel, if I could just interject quick. I thought also, just thinking about thunder quickly, it seems to me that what Lacan is saying here is when the name of the Father is instantiated, which is the law, it creates a space of ambiguity. Thunder becomes a place of ambiguity in which for the law to be instantiated, there has to be a threat of violence, but not necessarily violence enacted.
Yes.
The rumble of thunder is one in which it creates, he says, what does he say? The space for discourse, or the possibility of discourse, precisely because it brings about then the negotiation of the law that hasn't even necessarily been enacted, but is always threatening to be enacted, if that makes sense. Like, how much can I toe the line or not, basically?
It's the same. It's the same thing with a master signifier, in the sense that a master signifier, or even a master, relies on that kind of non-direct coercion, that kind of suggestive power, right? Which is precisely like the master par excellence, is the one who is not visible, is not seen, is in the background, is just kind of making signs work, allowing for is the precondition for the efficacy of signs, right?
Yes.
And the university discourse is trading in these signs, but it's only producing shame, and it's not absolutely able to traverse the very status of this excess enjoyment which seems to permeate it, right? So anyways,
Makes the globules.
but look at how frustrating these last few sentences are, Aaron. Please look at this. This is very, go ahead.
This is why there is no semblance, oh yes, of discourse. Everything that is discourse can only present itself as semblance, and nothing is built on it that is not at the basis of this something that is called signifier, which in the light of in which I put it forward for you today is identical to the status of the semblance. Also, I just had a couple notes on this paragraph. I should say this rainbow motif dates back to, actually haven't read the Psychoanalysis Seminar, but I know he brings it up there as an instance of the kind of primordial Freudian Behaung. Yes, Zizek has a lovely taking a part of that passage at the beginning of the preface to the second edition of the Ticklish subject. And then this idea of the thunder and name of the father, this actually goes back to his discussion of a child as being beaten. In both Seminar 5, and then is it 16, that's the logic of fantasy. I think he talks about it again, where he says the very crack of the whip is nom du père or the phallus, because those two terms are run together, obviously.
Right.
If I could just for a second, you reminded me, Aaron, also of Seminar 10 and anxiety when Lacan is going through the shofar, the Judaic tradition, and he's discussing he's talking about thunder a lot in that seminar, the thunderous roar which comes out of the scripture, which leads one, it's a sign of the name of the Father, quite literally, because it's through the thunderous roar that it kept everybody at the base of Mount Sinai. And of course, it was just that one signifier, one who brought the law from the top of the mountain.
That's great. So is everybody okay with this? I mean, this is, he seems to be not tripping, but conflating a few things.
Well, that's, I guess that's my question, is this idea of conflation or seeming conflation. Either it's easy to confuse semblance and signifier and the master position, or is it more that he's addressing a recursive structure or something recursive about, is recursivity an attribute of structure? If we're talking about, in a certain sense, structure is a resounding sort of emanation following in the wake of an event, it also carries with it as a signifier that causal event. So to that degree, is it also recursive rather than conflated or confused?
Yeah.
I'd say both. It both is and is not recursive. I know that's very maddening, but I mean the fact that obviously, like, the efficacy of a structure is premised on a recursive structure, that it can continuously bring things under signifiers, right? I mean, this is what a metaphor is. It's supplanting, putting one damn signifier on top of another. But at the same time, there's a limit to that. I mean, there is a limit to structure. Structure coincides, in fact, with its very own limits. That's obviously like a big theme of these next couple of seminars. It's the realist structure.
Is that okay if I ask a question?
Yeah.
I mean, like, something that keeps on coming back to me is, why is it, this, when you talk about an oracle, okay? And it's just something, what's the significance of that? Why does he speak of an oracle, and what's the significance of it? And why does he hold the oracle in opposition to the logical positivist? And, I think it's an obvious, but it's something that's playing on my mind. And it keeps on coming back, oracle, 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 and I want to know why.
It's the interpretation is efficacious not by virtue of naming some pre-established facts, a la logical positivism, which posits, truth to correspond to a prior state of affairs. As Lacan says, as early as Seminar 1, the meaning of symptoms comes from the future. Interpret what the oracle. I mean, after all, in the Oedipal myth, isn't it? The oracle's very, prediction, oration. What's the exact word for like an oracle's message?
Prophecy.
Huh?
Prophecy.
Yes, prophecy. Why can't I think of that? It's the very prophecy of the oracle that brings about the Oedipal story, his downfall. Correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it is, because his parents are told to abandon. Yes.
Yeah.
But also the root of oracle is oracular. It's to speak. The etymology of the word, it means to speak, and I think it's the archaic version of oracle. It's also that to speak ambiguously. In other words, not to speak necessarily. I think with a clear meaning, kind of like thunder.
Thank you. Lacanians are all about that oracular speech.
Thank you. No, it's just something that's help.
Yeah, but there's also the whole notion of the it speaks, which he had just referenced before. I think has a kind of homology to this logic, and even the very notion of the kind of depersonalized way that discourse situates a certain form of alienation for the subject is akin. I mean, if that's true, then that means that in some sense we're all subjected to a form of oracular determination by virtue of being unconscious speaking beings, right? So there's something even more primary at play there. I guess the problem that I have with this phrase here at the end here is he says, there is no semblance of discourse, okay? But would he say there's no signifier of discourse? Of course not. But then why does he say that the status of semblance is identical to the signifier? You see what I mean? So he's kind of, that's my biggest problem, is why is he conflating semblance with signifier? But maybe we'll...
Oh, wait, hold on.
Go ahead.
When he's saying there's no semblance of discourse, I'm taking that because discourse presents itself as semblance. You can't have a semblance of discourse because the semblance is already discourse. Like I don't know, you can't have an imitation of discourse, or you can't have, because it's still going to be discourse. Like it's all like there's no like second level to it. And that's the other thing I was wondering with semblance is the signifier in itself. Are we going to get to the signifier for itself or in and for itself at some point too?
Exactly. Yeah, and we do. I think we do when he gets to this whole business on Chinese philosophy. We'll just wait for that.
So just a question of methodology here, but but when he's talking of the word semblance, is he using the word in different ways in different paragraphs? So is he's not using it in one paragraph in the same way as he would use it in the other in terms of a is there multiple meanings or strings, in terms of how he's using it?
I don't think so. I think that he is trying to elaborate the title of the seminar for the whole year over and over and over.
Okay, so he's using it in a very specific sense.
I think so, and I think so. And then I think he's also introducing semblant, which is associated with artifact, right? Which we talked about. So I think it's those two forms. But we should probably continue, Aaron, please. Or if anybody else would like to read, feel free. But Aaron, you're doing an excellent, so please.
On a discourse that will not be a semblance. For it to be stated, it is necessary then that this a semblance can in no way be completed by reference to discourse. It is something else that is at stake. The referent, no doubt, restrain yourselves a little bit. This referent is probably not immediately an object, because precisely what that means is that this referent is precisely what is walking around. The semblance in which the discourse is identical to itself is at the level of the term semblance. It is the semblance in nature. It is not for nothing that I reminded you that no discourse that evokes nature ever did anything other than start from what in nature is a semblance, because nature is full of them. I'm not talking about animal nature, which quite obviously superabounds with them. This is even what ensures that there are gentle dreamers who think that the entire animal nature, from fish to birds, sings divine praises. It is self-evident. Every time they open like that, something a mouth and an operculum, it is manifest semblance. Nothing requires there to be gaps. When we go into something whose efficacy has not been settled, for the simple reason that we do not know how it has come, because signifiers, I can tell you, are scattered throughout the world, in nature, there by the shovelful. For language to come to birth, it is already something to initiate that. For language to be born, it was necessary that there should be established somewhere this something that I already indicated to you in connection with the wager. It was Pascal's wager. We do not remember it. In presupposing this, the trouble is that this already presupposes the functioning of language, because what is at stake is the unconscious. The unconscious and its operation means that among the numerous signifiers that travel the world, there's going to be, in addition, the fragmented body. There are, all the same, things from which one can start by thinking that they already exist. They already exist in a certain functioning in which we would not be forced to consider the accumulation of the signifier. It is this business about territory. If the signifier, your right arm, enters the territory of your neighbor to pick up something, there are things that happen all the time. Naturally, your neighbor grasps your signifier right arm and throws it back over the dividing wall. This is what you call, very curiously called, projection. Do you not? It is the way of understanding one another. It is from a phenomenon like that that we have to start. If your right arm in your neighbor's property was not entirely occupied in picking apples, for example, if it had stayed quiet, it is fairly probable that your neighbor would have adored it. It is the origin of the master signifier, or right arm, the scepter. The master signifier only needs to begin like that, right at the beginning.
So wait a second. So this is like the thunder in a certain sense. So like an inactive arm as a pure presence in the field of the neighbor's yard is a master signifier. However, it's not that when it is going to grasp something. Okay, I guess that makes sense. I'm a little confused about this, but okay, nonetheless, we can continue, I think.
Well, isn't there also a whole sort of humorous thing that sort of has to do with dispossession and an almost surreal thing about castration and stealing from the other? He makes this amusing thing that you, the listener, often rather lazily call it projection. You bad psychologists out there call it projection. But what really happens is that we misunderstand each other because we're always mishearing what's really going on. And we're always, in a kind of violence. It's another way of talking about class antagonism, really.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I guess the other difference is that by putting the arm into motion, into the economy of a discourse, you enter into it as a semblance, but there is a form of it prior as a master signifier, as like a kind of battery signifier, like as equivalent to what you would find in nature, like when you encounter a beautiful tree or a beautiful object, maybe. Because I do want to make sure that we're on the same page with this notion of how does a accumulation of signifiers appear in nature? Like, I think somebody could maybe elaborate on that, that would be helpful.
Does Lacan talk about, I mean, from what he was talking about in nature, we said where there's no gaps.
Yeah.
When he spoke about there's no
You know
gaps.
what that is? That is like Gaia spirituality, or like Franciscanism, right? Which,
Okay, yeah.
a particular view of nature as non-antagonistic semblance, right? If you know, the notion that even human discourse has a kind of a true linkage, a true mediation role, like Francis would assume. And you know what, I think that's more what he's saying, but Lacan's saying that this is obviously not the case, because nature as such is riddled with batteries of signifiers. So my question is, how does that work in nature? Like, yeah, what's the Lacanian response to Gaia spirituality?
It's sort of sits odd alongside Sabo Tomsik in The Capitalist Unconscious talks a bit about this whole passage, in fact, from Seminar 18 when discussing it's in the context of discussing Marxist fetishism and how Marx's analysis of the fetishism tracks a similar movement to Semblance, a move from subjective to objective. And basically, the thing is that just sits odd with it. Is that I'd say basically, I mean, the signifier is a differential order. It's not natural. I'd have to review the passage at hand.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to belabor the point, but I just want to make sure we're not going too fast.
Can I just when he's talking about the neighbor on the wall, he's using that as an analogy to describe what's happening in nature. So this metaphor of this business thing, about, it seems like apple scrumping, or nicking apples or something, is being used as a way of the production of how signifiers appear in nature. And I was just wondering if anyone can make anything from that. Is there anything there?
When we're bringing territory into it, after that accumulation of
when he brings in territory, he's using that as a metaphor or an analogy for what.
Yeah, well, we've got the historical legal definition of jouissance coming into play, don't we? Like jouissance, like the use of another's land when walking through a pass is like the one historical version of it. Like that's what I'm reading here, where you have the sort of buildup of territory, which then implies the sort of jouissance of projection in a certain way, where you're going into the territory of the other signifier. That I'm taking the master figure here as having that appearance of the one who kind of abstains from that enjoyment until, of course, you get to the pair version or whatever. And it's that like the hand that doesn't reach out for the apple and the signifier, the other's territory, that then gets the appearance of the master signifier to it because it appears not to be enjoying.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Well, I guess my problem was he's introducing a variable, which is the fragmented body. What I was having a hard time understanding was like, is he presenting a theory of like the presence of signifiers within a context of pure nature? And I don't think he is. I think he's still talking about a form of nature in which the unconscious speaking being is engaged in it. So it's okay.
I found the note I had made on Tomsik. He says the emergence of the signifier denaturalizes the semblance in nature by introducing into nature something that its semblances do not possess, difference. Yeah, and unlike natural semblance, the discursive semblance is pure difference. S1, the master signifier, which signifies the non-identity of every signifier with itself.
Okay. So, but again, the battery of signifiers is coming from where? They're in nature, but maybe they are in nature in a certain form as in a non-differential form. What again? convokes difference?
The signifier. This is the. It brings us back to the the earlier what I mentioned earlier as regards Chiesa's in-dash difference, because he talks about this, how, you know, nature in itself doesn't have difference. It is just sheer indifference, no dash. It's very weird. This is like ultimate high speculative
I know. Yeah.
seeing
Yeah.
Just
stuff.
hieroglyphics, would it be related to like I remember Lacan writes something similar about our experience of hieroglyphics, insofar that we can see this meaning, but we can't get to it. I don't know. I'm just sorry, I'm just thinking out loud. Sorry.
No, that's precisely his definition of the letter. It's the real of the signifier. It is its very material instantiation, and hieroglyphs really bring that to bear. We can minimally project some kind of meaning. It's much like the unary mark he talks about elsewhere, but we can't as of yet attribute a determinate meaning to it. It has a minimal degree of unicity and is kind of, I don't know, it certainly is beginning to partake of difference, and yet is not situated in a determinate, you know, meaningful system of differences.
Thank you very much for putting into words, but my tired brain couldn't really, you know, I just shouted out hieroglyphics, but you know, you basically said what I was trying to, so. Thank you very much, yeah.
Yeah. No, it's very good. Okay, let's move here. We're doing actually pretty well. I've done 2-hour cartels that just do like 3 pages, so this is good progress. I say we continue. We have about 20 minutes left.
Go on.
Please. I think you're right here, right? Unfortunately.
Something like that.
Did I skip some?
Or no? Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
On track.
All right.
Unfortunately, it requires a little bit more. It is an unsatisfactory schema. Going a little further, that gives you the scepter. Right away, you see the thing materializing as signifier. The process of history shows itself to every testimony, and the ones that we have, a little more complicated. It is certain that the little parable, the one with which I first began, the arm that is thrown back from one territory into another, it is not necessarily your arm that comes back to you, because signifiers are not individual. One does not know who owns which. So there you see, here we enter into a different kind of original operation as regards the function of chance and that of myths. You construct a world, on this occasion, let us say a schema, a support divided like that into a certain number of territorial cells. This happens at a certain level, the one at which it is a matter of putting forward, where it is a matter of understanding a little what has happened. After all, not alone can one get an arm that is not one's own. In the process of expulsion that you have called, I do not know why, projection, if it is only that you are projected, of course, not simply an arm which is not yours, but several other arms. So then from that moment on, it is no longer important whether it is yours or whether it is not yours. But anyway, after all, inside a territory, one only knows one's own frontiers. One does not have to know that on this frontier, there are 6 other territories. You throw it a little bit as you wish, so then it can happen that there's a whole shower of territories. The idea of the relationship that may exist between the rejection of something and the birth of what I called earlier the master signifier is certainly an idea to remember. But for it to have its whole value, it is certainly necessary that there should have been, by a process of chance, at certain points, an accumulation of signifiers. Starting from there, it is possible to conceive something that might be the birth of language. What we see, properly speaking, being built up as the first way of supporting and writing what serves as language gives in any case a certain idea. Everyone knows that the letter A is a bull's head turned upside down, and a certain number of elements like this movable still leave their trace. What is important is not to go too fast and to see where holes continue to remain. For example, it is quite obvious that the start of this outline was already linked to something marking the body with the possibility of ectopia and of excursion that obviously remains problematic. After all, here again, everything is still here. And we have finally, this is a very sensitive point, that we can still test every day. Not too long ago, again this week, something very pretty photos in the newspaper that everyone was delighted with, the possibilities of the practice of cutting up a human being on another human being are quite impressive. It is from there that everything started.
You know, I'm thinking here of Mirror Stage and the polymorphous perversion of the position of the young child, right? Like this is the whole notion of fragmented body, which my question is that does that mirror nature? Is that a way to say it? Maybe. But then the difference is that nature is that it has those holes, it has those that fragmentation, because it is composed of a treasure of signifiers that it has kind of collected in the scepter. I don't know if that kind of makes sense to you all, that there's a kind of homology there of the fragmented body pre-mirror stage with nature.
Go on.
Oh, good. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I don't know. I take it that particularly in the revision of the mirror phase Lacan makes, I mean, he increasingly puts more and more emphasis on effectively retroactive operation. And so that when we speak, you know, obviously we can speak of a fragmentation of the infantile body as such. It is not very well coordinated. You know, its introduction, its induction into, you know, the world of the socio-symbolic is mediated by, you know, all of these partializing functions of the mouth, the anus, etc.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can speak of this, you know, kind of tenuous body. I think the proper fragmentation of the body we associate with infantile polymorphous perversity only becomes as such retroactively.
Yeah.
You know, there's always a degree, there's this minimum degree of difference that's always there with the speaking animal.
Yeah, that's helpful. I also think this business of territory has a total political dynamic, because in the championing of the Marquis de Sade vision, you know, what we have is a proposal of a kind of flourishing of a disregard for territorial boundaries and so on. And I think in this model, what he's developing here is that you have a multiplicity of territories, but they need to be dignified and kind of respected unto each. You see what I'm saying? So it's a big leap from the sympathies that he invoked in the ethics seminar with de Sade, I would say.
It's always the problem of loving one's neighbor, right?
Yeah. No, for sure. So there's, but yes, absolutely. But I guess I want to understand this business of how holes appear in nature. So maybe we should continue.
I think the holing in nature, this is why he likes Fregean logic, is because it has holes, which are the arguments or variables of the function. This is a way of decoupling existence from essence. That is kind of, you know, blowing up the whole Aristotelian telos of nature.
Yeah, that's nice. That's really nice. Yeah.
Go on.
No, please. I think unless anyone wishes to continue, I think it's, please go.
There remains another hole. As you know, people have tormented themselves about it. People have noted that Hegel is all very well, but there is all the same something that he did not explain. He explains the dialectic of the master and slave, but he does not know how to explain how there can be a society of masters. It is quite clear that what I have just explained to you is certainly interesting in that by the simple operation of projection, of retort, it is clear that at the end of a certain number of throws, there will certainly be, I will say, a greater average of signifiers in certain territories than others. Anyway, it still remains to be seen how the signifier is going to be able to construct a society of signifiers in this territory. One should never leave in the shadows what one does not explain under the pretext that one has succeeded in giving some little beginning of explanation. In any case, the statement of our title this year on a discourse that is not a semblance concerns something that deals with an economy. We will hide the asemblance from itself. It is not a semblance of something else. It is to be taken in the sense of the objective genitive, which is at stake is the discourse as proper object by which there is ruled a proper economy of discourse. Are we going to say that it is also a subjective genitive? Does al semblant concern also what gives the discourse? The word subjective is the only one to be rejected here for the simple reason that the subject only appears once there has been established somewhere this liaison of signifiers. A subject can only be the product of signifying articulation. A subject as such never masters in any case this articulation, but is properly speaking determined by it. A discourse by its nature appears, as one might say, to be a success, or to be light, or to be chic. If one is stated in words, is precisely true by always being very authentically what it is, at the level we are at, of the objective and of articulation. It is then very precisely as object of what is produced in this aforesaid discourse that the semblance is posited. Hence the properly senseless character of what is articulated. And it must be said that is here indeed that there is revealed what is involved in the richness of language, namely that it contains a logic that surpasses by far everything that we succeeded in crystallizing of it, in detaching from it.
So senselessness is in the sort of second movement of some, like, yeah, that's interesting. Then my first thought then, of course, is what then is the relationship between the logic of a phallic order, which is also hinged on senselessness, and this form of semblance, which is also senseless. And I think that's a distinction he's going to draw out. But yeah, okay, this is making sense because he's kind of repeating a lot of things, you know? So this is, I think we can continue. I think this is going pretty well.
I employed the hypothetical form of discourse which might not be a semblance. Everyone knows the developments that logic took on after Aristotle. By putting the emphasis on the hypothetical function, everything that is articulated by giving the value true or false to the articulation of hypothesis, does it just...
Sorry, hold on, I'm trying to move it. Here, I'll just go like this. There we go.
Okay, and combining what results from the implication of a term within this hypothesis as being signaled as true. This is the inauguration of what is called the Modus Ponens, and of still many other modes, and everyone knows what was made of them. It is striking, at least as far as I know, that no one has ever formalized the resource involved in the use of this hypothetical in the negative. A striking thing, if one refers, for example, to what is collected about it in my Acquis, when someone at the epoch, a heroic epoch, at which I began to clear up the terrain of analysis, when someone came to contribute to the deciphering of the Verneinung, even though in commenting Freud letter by letter, he noticed very clearly, because Freud says it quite literally that the Behaung only involves a judgment of attribution, which means that Freud shows a finesse and a competence that are quite exceptional at the same time he wrote this, because only some logician who is not widely known was able at that time to underline it. The judgment of attribution in no way prejudges existence. The simple positing of a Verneinung, Verneinung, implies the existence of something which is very precisely what is denied. A discourse which might not be a semblance posits that the discourse, as I've just stated, is a semblance. The great advantage in putting it like that is that one does not say a semblance of what. Now it is here, of course. It is around this that I propose to advance our statements, namely to get to know what is involved where it might not be a semblance. Naturally, the terrain is prepared by a singular, even timid step, which is the one that Freud took in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Here, I do not want, because I cannot do any more than indicate the not formed in this statement by repetition and enjoyment. It is in this function of this that repetition goes against the pleasure principle, which I would say does not recover from it. Hedonism in the light of analytic experience can only go back to what it is, namely a philosophical myth. I mean a myth of a perfectly defined and clear class. And I stated last year the help that they might have given to a certain process of the master by permitting the discourse of the master as such to build up a knowledge. This knowledge is the knowledge of the master. This knowledge has supposed, since the philosophical discourse still carries its trace, the existence over and against the master of another knowledge. And thank God philosophical discourse did not disappear with that first pinpointing that there ought to be at the origin a relationship between this knowledge and enjoyment. The one who has thus closed philosophical discourse, Hegel, to give him his name, naturally only sees the way in which through work, slavery comes to accomplish what? Nothing other than knowledge of the master. What is introduced anew by what I call the Freudian hypothesis? It is an extraordinarily prudent, but all the same a syllogistic form the following. If we call the pleasure principle the fact that always by the behavior of the living being, he comes back to a level which is that of minimal excitation, and that this rules his economy, if it proves to be the case that repetition is exercised in such a way that a dangerous enjoyment, an enjoyment that goes beyond this minimal excitation, is brought back, it is possible, it is in this way that Freud states the question, that it could be imagined that life, caught up itself in its cycle, it is a novelty with respect to this world which does not universally comprise it. That life includes the possibility of a repetition, which would be the return to this world insofar as it is a semblance.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. I don't know. I have a love-hate relationship to this glorious syllogism for its clarity and so on. But I have some problems as well, and some confusions. My first one is precisely how the repetition, which would be the return to this world insofar as it is a semblance. Does that mean that this particular form of a certain type of a dangerous enjoyment that's bound up with a repetition compulsion, how do you understand its reliance on the world insofar as it is a semblance? That's what I'm not seeing.
Wait, it remains a question at the end. It's a question. insofar as it is a semblance, question mark.
Okay, it is a novelty with respect to this world which does not universally comprise it, that life includes this possibility of repetition, which would be the return to this world, insofar as it is a semblance.
Question mark.
Yeah. Okay, help me further, like,
He's saying we've gotten this far, but where does that bring us?
Right. What he seems to be talking about is the way that enjoyment expresses itself in the world is through semblance as a certain mirage of meaning that is hooked by a point, of nonsense, is how I read this. That there's something that he's not fully, is semblance, in what way is it bound up with this form of dangerous enjoyment? But anyways, this whole thing is crazy. This whole syllogism is like a Zen koan as far as I'm concerned. I have a love-hate thing going on here, so my apologies.
Wait.
No, okay, sorry, we're not done yet.
We go back to this because he says it is a novelty with respect to this world which does not universally comprise it.
Yeah.
And then it remains a question.
Yeah. That's right.
Which is the issue there?
Yeah. There's something about the enjoyment which has a kind of non-symmetry, a non-rapport with the world. Therefore, it enters the world only on condition of semblance, or something like that.
Right. And then it becomes a question of, well, what does it do? Where does it work, or what does it? How does it work politically, etc.? If it remains, it works. He recognizes it to work as it is a novelty.
Right.
In what regard does it operate? Where are we at? He recognizes it. It's not in the position of a master. It's not in the position of philosophical certainty. That's the realm of Hegel, as he understands Hegel. Okay. Yeah. It is not Hegel. But what is it? He's not entirely sure what it is.
Well, wait, and isn't this also, because he's saying this is how Freud states the question, and the question starts up at the end of the semicolon further above, right? That if it proves to be the case that the repetition is exercised in such a way. So isn't this kind of just questioning, because Freud brings the death drive, this repetition, all the way back to the inorganic, right? So it's not just a novelty within life, or even a novelty within, it's not a novelty just within discourse. It was kind of Freud's speculative hypothesis, right? That then the enjoyment or excitations of repetition have something of a return to the inorganic at almost like an ontological level. I feel like this is maybe even a semi-rhetorical like question where his answer, I would assume, kind of even comes to be no. That
maybe we're not done actually.
Yeah.
So we should actually.
No, I was just going to say, when it came to me, the concept of repetition, it takes it outside of itself. The concept of anamnesis, the idea of repetition, but with a difference. Does that have any?
Well,
anything?
I almost feel like we need to finish this, and we should check. I'll have we'll check the French to see maybe if what is written on the board can be, if we have access to it, that would be probably helpful.
A very brief note, something that might be useful is Kopjek has a short discussion of Bergson in her essay Cutting Up and Read My Desire in relation to Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle, precisely turning on this theme of novelty.
That could be very relevant, yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Let's continue, because maybe we kind of want to return to this problem by going through.
I can point out to you by drawing on the board that this involves, instead of the series of ascending and descending curves of excitation, all close to a limit, which is an upper limit, the possibility of an intensity of excitation that can moreover go on to infinity. What is conceived as enjoyment, not involving in itself in principle any other limit, and this lower tangential point, this point that we will call high, in giving its proper sense to the word, which means the lowest point of a higher limit. In the same way as the lowest is the highest point of a lower limit, the coherence given of the mortal point, then conceived without Freud, underlining it as a characteristic of life, but in truth, what people do not think of is, in effect, the fact that we confuse what is non-life, and which is, far my word, from not stirring up the eternal silence of the infinite spaces that dazed Descartes. They talk, they sing, they move about in every way, but we now look to them. What is called the inanimate world is not dead. Dead is a point. Death is a point. It is designated as a terminal point at the term of what? Of the enjoyment of life. This is precisely what is introduced by the Freudian statement, one that we could qualify as a hyperhedonism, if I can express myself in this way. Who can fail to see it that the economy in that of nature is always a fact of discourse? It cannot grasp that this indicates that nothing else could be at stake here but enjoyment, insofar as it is itself not only a fact but an effect of discourse. If something that is called the unconscious can be half said as a language structure, it is so that finally there can appear to us the relief of this language of the relief of this effective discourse that up to then appeared to us as impossible, namely surplus enjoying. Does that mean, to follow one of my formulae, that is, insofar as it was impossible, it functioned as real? I'm opening up the question because in truth, nothing implies that the eruption of the discourse of the unconscious, however stammering it remains, implies anything whatsoever in what preceded it that was subjected to its structure. The discourse of the unconscious is an emerging. It is the emerging of a certain function of the signifier. That it existed up to then as a token is indeed the reason why I put it at the source of the semblance. But the consequence.
Sorry, it is 4 minutes after 10, so maybe this is a good place to stop. Let me just check one quick thing. We are, never mind. Bring it home, please.
But the consequences of its emerging is what ought to be introduced so that something may change, which cannot change because it is not possible. It is on the contrary because a discourse is centered from its effect as impossible that it will have some chance of being a discourse that might not be a semblance.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So we know now that the provocation of the title of the seminar on a discourse that might not be a semblance. And we did notice, as Mark mentioned, that he says it differently. A discourse that will not be, a discourse that might be, yeah, all of that, there's that. But then we also know that he's duping us because the phrase produces a new semblance in some way. So in that way,
is he playing with modes?
It's a play on the impossible real. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I wonder, is he making a play on modalities here? I'm just thinking of also the different grammatical cases of might, will, and then he talks about, of course, modus ponens and the different logical modalities that then, the cavalcade of modalities that opens up.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, I'm always surprised at how tacit Lacanians are about Lacan's own, I think, influence by Spinoza, and the idea that modes create new semblances might also be at play here.
Yeah. That would be a fun little study to kind of piece that apart. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, I know that he says might, will, and is.
And those are, yeah.
So I don't know if that maps on, but
You might say that a discourse that would not be of semblance is thus a discourse about that from which within semblance is not of semblance. The real is impossible, which cannot be written formalized as such. At the same time, it is a discourse about that which, from the perspective of semblance, would be if semblance were not, which is the sexual relationship.
right. Yeah. Yes, and he's going to get into that in the next session. So I'm already super excited to meet again next week. I kind of want to do it sooner. This is a lot of fun. I really want to thank you.
Getting very excited, Daniel.
Yeah, no, this obviously, like, you know, we do these things and we erase ourselves, like we experience that it exists, you know. So for that, I am grateful, to be honest. Sorry, go on. So we'll meet again in 1 week. I hope you all have a nice, holiday weekend. If you want to read this seminar session, that would be cool. And should I create a Dropbox with extra readings? Because I mentioned the Zizek reading, Russell Grigg reading, and then anything else people want to throw into it. That might be cool.
Excellent.
Yeah, okay. All right, good. So everybody's feeling good. Any comments or questions before we cut for the night?
If geometry comes up real heavy, as I'm sensing it might in this discourse, that might not be a semblance. I got a real heel turn coming up. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you, Aaron, for a very invigorating and energetic reading.
Thanks for reading. I appreciate it. Very cool.
Yeah, and for your interpretations and for all of your comments, everyone. And yeah, I wish you guys all the best. Be well. Take care.
Godspeed.
Have a good one.
Later.